Good afternoon, everyone. I'm joined here today by NDP Energy Critic Kathleen Ganley. Later today, I'll be questioning the Premier and Executive Council budget estimates, and I'll be raising issues that are critical to Albertans. Albertans from one corner of this province to the other have been hit very hard with massive cost increases, and 6 in 10 Albertans report no longer being able to make ends meet. Nearly half of Albertans are worried either they or someone in their household will lose their job, and only half think they can financially handle any form of emergency expense. Now, the UCP government knows all this, and yet they've deliberately ignored what's really facing Albertans. And when they have acted, the meager support they've provided was insulting. A fake, unfunded natural gas rebate that will never take effect, and then subsequently scrambling to put in place a paltry $50 per month electricity rebate that is completely inadequate to help families facing utility costs in excess of $700 per month, and who owe, in many cases, thousands in unpaid bills, having accrued over several months of this crisis. This is a result of the UCP removing the price protection that we had put in place. Now, even if the government stepped up with real support today, it would be far too late for many families when it comes to utilities. They need real relief, and they also need to avoid the stress of potentially having their utilities shut off. And that's why we've raised this issue yesterday. And later today, Kathleen Ganley will be bringing forward a motion for debate into the legislature on extending the utility non-disconnect period past April 15th, as is currently legislated. It's easy to be cynical about the legislature some days. I understand that. But this kind of approach did succeed once before in bringing legislation to the government to provide paid leave for Albertans to get themselves vaccinated. And when we did that, it passed in one day. I'm hopeful the government will consider this proposal in the same spirit. Now, I want to be clear. This doesn't mean that we don't still need real rebates, because we do. What this act would do, though, it would keep the lights on and the heat running. It won't, in the long term, help families who are dealing with mounting debt. But it is a step the government can take now to relieve some of the stress that Alberta families are experiencing. Kathleen, along with our staff, even drafted a bill to extend this non-disconnect period, and we sent it to the government. Now, that was yesterday, and we haven't heard anything back yet, which is concerning. And I am a little worried that, in fact, what's actually going on here is that they're just too embroiled in their own drama and their own internal conflicts to focus on the kinds of things that actually matter to Albertans. UCP government staff are being encouraged to stop work at 4 so they can make calls to save Jason Kenney's job. The Premier's Chief of Staff actually left her post to spearhead the campaign to save his job. And cabinet ministers are spending their days fending off nomination challenges in their own backyards, focusing on saving their jobs. What everybody that I just mentioned should be doing is working with Albertans, going out and consulting with those Albertans about how to rewrite this budget and offer real help to Albertans. So far, this budget hikes taxes on families by $1 billion through bracket creep scheme that the Premier himself once described as sneaky and insidious. This budget cuts the number of teachers in schools when we should be adding them. It cuts $800 million from healthcare compared to last year, while the UCP at the same time seeks to slash the wages of frontline workers. Now, affordability and healthcare should be the priorities of this government because those are the priorities of Albertans. Instead, it's all UCP drama. Later today, in estimates, I will question the Premier on how many taxpayer-funded staff members are missing in action right now, and how many of them are foregoing their public responsibility while they peddle memberships to save their boss's job. And I'll be questioning the Premier why, during an affordability crisis that is hurting families like never before, the Premier and his team are campaigning for themselves, not for Albertans. Albertans deserve better. They deserve a government focused on creating jobs for them, not on saving their own. And it's with Albertans and families and business owners in mind that I'll be asking these questions to the Premier today. So thank you, and we'll be happy to take any questions you might have.
We don't have a ton of time, but we'll start on the floor.
Rachel, we need to ask about the by-election last night and Brian Jean. You seem to occupy a fair amount of space in his head. What do you think about his election last night?
Listen, I think that last night was yet another chapter in what appears to be an unending drama about the UCP's focus on itself, its own navel-gazing, its own palace intrigue, its own fighting. And the problem with that is they're not focusing on the urgent needs being confronted and the crises and the concerns that Albertans have themselves. And that was clear certainly in the by-election itself, and in terms of the commentary afterward, it was all about the internal fight. And Albertans, what they're worried about is their bills, they're worried about affordability, they're worried about getting their healthcare system back on track. These are the things that we know are front and center for the people of this province.
For electability, who would you rather be the UCP leader, Kenney or Brian Jean?
Honestly, here's the thing, it really doesn't matter, because as much as people are trying to take the multiple failures of this UCP government, their ongoing tone-deaf response to the real needs of Alberta families and pin it to one person or another, the fact is, it's this UCP organization. They have failed as government from day one. They have been focused on power from day one. They have failed to stand up for regular Alberta families and focus on what they need from day one. So it honestly doesn't matter.
Let me rephrase that. Who would you rather face down in an election, Brian Jean or Jason Kenney?
Honestly, I truly do not care. As long as they are leading the UCP, a government that has, with the record that this UCP government has, I look forward to being able to talk to Albertans what a government focused on their actual needs, focused on public service, focused on improving affordability and protecting health care looks like. That'll be the government that we are presenting, the platform that we are presenting. If they're planning to lead the UCP, it'll be the same either way.
Any other questions on the floor? I'll go to the phones. Just a reminder to press star 9 if you're joining us on the phone. Raise hand function if you're joining us via Zoom. Seeing none, that's all from Rachel Notley, and we'll go to Richard Feehan.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Right.
Rakhi is here.
Yeah, well, I think they said that.
Good afternoon. I acknowledge that we are gathered here today on Treaty 6 territory, and I acknowledge the Métis people who share a deep connection with this land. I would like to draw much needed attention to some deeply concerning figures released by the Ministry of Children's Services yesterday. Since last receiving a report from Child Intervention Services up to October 31st, 15 more young people receiving child intervention services have died. Every one of those young Albertans was Indigenous. 15 young Albertans in 4 months. We're only 2 weeks away from the start of the new year of reporting. And in this year, so far, 45 young people have died, either in the care of the government or within 2 years of receiving child protection services. More than any other year, 80% of them are Indigenous. These young Albertans have experienced more hardship than most adults ever will. These young Albertans were put into the care of the government for a chance at a new start, and the government failed them. A government that has a track record of willingly putting young people at risk, from lowering the age of eligibility for SFAA supports to dismantling the recommendations of the Ministerial Panel on Child Intervention, to fully ignoring recommendations from the Child and Youth Advocate on how to improve the outcomes for young people in care. The UCP government cannot be trusted with the well-being and the lives of young people. And what's concerning is the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in these incredibly grim statistics. My colleagues and I have demanded more accountability from this government. The Child and Youth Advocate has demanded more accountability from this government. Leaders of First Nations and Métis communities have demanded more accountability from this government. In the year-end report from the OCYA, Delgraft raised his concerns about the overrepresentation of Indigenous young people in the child welfare system, and at the time it represented 64% of cases. That number has now grown to 68%. I will be heading into the House today, along with my peer Rakhi Pancholi, and demand that the Minister of Children's Services and the Minister of Indigenous Relations answer on what their government is doing to improve the outcome for children in care. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Go to the floor.
Minister, I guess, what is your response or what is your thinking behind why this has been the deadliest year on record?
Well, it's hard to pin it down into one singular thing. The reality is that we know from history that Indigenous people are overrepresented in a number of difficult areas in our society, and that the large cause of that are structural issues, systemic issues in society, the treatment of Indigenous people in the history of the province, and the nature of the intervention services that have been provided over the years. It certainly is time for us to bring all of the ministries together to have a complex and fulsome discussion about how this needs to be resolved. And the children's advocate Delgraft has asked for that on a number of occasions, and yet this government has refused to have ministers appear in front of a committee to answer these questions. When we've asked about them in front of estimates, we're told this is not the place for that. When we've asked for them in committee, we're told this is not the place for that. We're constantly hearing that there is no point at which the government feels accountable. And it's time that they become accountable and that they actually appear, every ministry that needs to be involved, in front of people who can ask the questions that you're asking now.
And is there a particular part of the system that you think is the most broken that you would like to see resolved?
Well, as I said, my answer would have to be very complex. I mean, I would like to point out one particular piece, but then I would be neglecting the other pieces. I certainly think that the child welfare system has to be at the forefront of this, however. That the nature of the system has to be changed to ensure that the focus of the system is the support of families to be the best that they can be. And that has not always been the case. I mean, it's 40 years since I was a frontline child welfare worker, but I certainly know from my conversations with social workers and others who are involved in the system that the focus is not there, that the resources are not there, and that it's time for us to take this fully seriously and to do the things that we need to do, not only in child welfare, but in healthcare, in the judicial system, and other parts of the government intervention.
Other questions on the floor? I'll go to questions on the phone. Just a reminder to press *9 if you're on the phone. Raise hand if you're joining us via Zoom. And we'll go to our first caller.
Great, Harold. I apologize if this question has been asked. I couldn't really hear what was being said on the floor there. But is there any indication of what is leading this large spike over the last few months and over the last year?
I'm afraid we don't have the information, and that's part of the problem. That we need to go back to the people who do have the information, which is the various departments of the government, and ask them to examine the issues and ask them to present those issues in a way that makes them accountable to the public in the province of Alberta. If we don't have that information brought forward, if we do not have the ministers available to answer questions and to be accountable, then we'll never be able to make progress.
Any follow-up, Dylan?
Yeah, obviously there hasn't been a lot of success in getting the parties committee to question the different ministries involved. But I guess just obviously it's a different picture now, unfortunately, with even more dusting we've seen in the past. Do you think that there might be some traction now, given the numbers that we're seeing, to form this committee?
Unfortunately, sometimes it takes a deep tragedy to inspire action. And unfortunately, this government is one that has demonstrated time and time again that they are prepared to wait for that deep tragedy, and they have done so again. And I think it's time that they establish a venue to discuss these issues and to resolve them.
Thank you, and that's all for today.
Thank you.
Tens of thousands of Albertans have already provided their idea for how we can build Alberta's future. You can too by going to albertasfuture.ca.